The year is 1945. The Soviet Red Army had started to enter Berlin by the 21st of April, and the Western Allies were making progress in the row. Germany had failed in the Battle of the Bulge, and the military was in disarray. Meanwhile, Hitler remained in Berlin, secure in his frontier underneath the Reich's chancellery. It was built over 8 meters deep underground, designed to withstand Allied bombardment. The bunker had 18 rooms and was protected by steel doors and a group of loyal SS guards. But it was a dark, claustrophobic space with as many as 50 people living underground towards the end of the war. On the 1st of May, with the Red Army all but victorious, General Hans Krebs sought to surrender to the Soviets. He had been one of the generals in the bunker, and when he met with the Soviets, he explained that Hitler was now dead. When the Soviets captured the Reich Chancellery on the 2nd of May 1945, they found that the bunker had been abandoned. Those remaining had attempted to escape the city. All were dead. The Soviets set about uncovering just what had happened to Hitler. They were aware that a number of planes had flown in and out of Berlin just weeks before the city fell. Many did not believe that Hitler had remained in Berlin. They suspected that he could have escaped. Nevertheless, they learned that just outside the Chancellery Gardens, a number of Nazis had been buried in a makeshift graveyard, and so they began to search this area. Meanwhile, as for the Western Allies, news soon reached them that Hitler was dead, as told by Marshal Zhukov. However, for whatever reason, Zhukov soon changed his story. He started to claim that Hitler's body had not been found and hinted that Hitler could have indeed escaped Berlin by plane. Stalin then pushed the narrative himself that Hitler had escaped to Norway by plane and from there had fled to Argentina or Spain. The story was deemed plausible, as many Nazis had done the same. The infamous Dr. Mengele, who had performed twisted experiments on prisoners in Auschwitz, was one of the thousands of Nazis who had fled to Argentina. But this wasn't the only theory pushed by the Soviets. Stalin would later claim that rather than Argentina, Hitler had actually fled to Japan. In response to this confusion, British intelligence tasked an intelligence officer named Hugh Trevor Rowe with uncovering just what had happened to Hitler. Trevor Rowe set about interviewing Nazi officials and staff who had been in the bunker during Hitler's last few days. From his research, Trevor Rowe compiled a reconstruction of what he believed happened, which would then become the book, The Last Days of Hitler. This narrative would become the standard, accepted for decades to come. Trevor Rowe's timeline would be as follows. Hitler had been in the bunker since January 1945, using it as his living quarters and command post, even with the German army in retreat and the Soviets shelling Berlin. Hitler believed that the war could still be won. He believed that he could summon an army to save Berlin. But when this army that Hitler believed existed failed to materialize and save Berlin, he fell into a tearful rage. The war was lost. Hitler was well aware as to the fate of Benito Mussolini, the fascist dictator of Italy. He had seen how Mussolini was captured, humiliated, and brutally murdered. Mussolini's body was mutilated beyond recognition, and he was strung up for all to see. Even with the Soviets closing in, Hitler was adamant that he would not meet such a fate. Hitler's longtime girlfriend, Eva Braun, too, resolved to remain in the bunker and die with Hitler. Hitler had remained unmarried during his rule of Germany, but on the evening of the 28th of April 1945, Hitler and Braun were to finally marry. The ceremony was brief, witnessed by Josef Goebbels and Martin Bormann. It was conducted by a local official and took place as the Red Army rained artillery shells from above. The following day, Hitler dictated his last personal and political testament. On the 30th of April, at around 2:30 p.m., Hitler and his new wife bid farewell to their staff that was still in the bunker. They then entered Hitler's personal quarters, taking with them some cyanide capsules. Moments later, a bullet could be heard ringing out from the room. After a few moments, Hitler's valet Heinz Linger entered the room. Inside, he found Hitler. And Braun dead. Linger had been instructed by Hitler to ensure his body was burned and did not end up in Soviet hands. The bodies were taken upstairs to the garden of the Reich's chancellery, but with only a small amount of petrol, the initial cremation was incomplete. More material was thrown onto the burning bodies, allowing the fire to take hold and burn them, until they were unrecognizable. The remains were then buried, dumped into an artillery crater, and covered over with dirt. This account would be what the Western Allies would rely upon, but without a body, it would be difficult to know for sure. As a result, efforts were made to follow up on the claims made by the Soviets, with Western intelligence agencies following up on any and all potential sightings of the Führer. There was one notable clue related to rumors of the apparent discovery of Hitler's jawbone uncovered by the Soviets. American intelligence had managed to interview a man named Dr. Hugo Blushka, Hitler's personal dentist. He told the Americans that he heard that his assistant, Kath Huysman, had examined the job for the Soviets and identified it as belonging to Hitler. This was based on the number and location of a number of dentures and bridges Hitler wore on account of the post-state of his teeth. But the Soviets did not confirm the existence of such a jawbone, and it turned out that Kath Huysman had been arrested and imprisoned by the Soviets. The Western Allies were then satisfied that Hitler was in fact dead based on their investigations, but the claims from the Soviets and rumors of his escape meant that there was still a questionable doubt. Then in 1948, there was an account from a German lieutenant by the name of Arthur F. Mackinson. Arthur's account purported to shed light on what had happened to Hitler. Mackinson claimed that he had been tasked with escorting Hitler and Braun to Denmark and then on a submarine to Argentina. But there was just two major problems with this first-hand account. Firstly, there was no evidence of such a journey ever taking place. Western intelligence had attempted to trace escapes via U-boat to Argentina, but none of them matched his story. And then secondly, and crucially, the person known as Arth Fackinson did not even exist. It was simply a fabricated story to sell newspapers. But this would not be the last falsehood spread around Hitler's fate. The notion that Hitler survived would inspire all manner of scams and conspiracies. Just a year after the war had ended, a mail fraud scam took hold in the United States. For 10 years, a sender calling themselves Furia No. 1 posted a number of letters detailing that they were in fact Adolf Hitler. They claimed that they had survived the war, fled to Kentucky, and were building a series of underground factories and bases to prepare for the invasion of the United States. These letters promised anyone who provided financial contributions to this cause would be guaranteed a place of prominence in the new regime. Now, remarkably, this fraud is believed to have scammed as much as $50,000 before it was discovered that the culprit was actually William Henry Johnson, a miner and part-time mountain preacher. But there would be even more twists in the tale of Hitler's fate. In the 1960s, the narrative switched again with claims that the Soviets had not only located a jawbone, but Hitler's entire burned body. This would be published in 1965 in the memoirs of a Soviet translator who had been in Berlin at the end of the war. Elenina Revskier wrote how she had been given a small jewelry box containing Hitler's jawbone and his dentures. She was tasked with safeguarding the jawbone of Hitler, trusted by her commanding officer to not get drunk and lose this vital piece of evidence. Elenina had been part of the team to track down the dentists. And in her published memoirs, which somehow made it through the Soviet census, she mentioned that Hitler's remains had been dug up. These, however, were unrecognizable, and that's why the focus was on the jawbone. Further information would come about in 1968 in the publishing of The Death of Adolf Hitler, unknown documents from Soviet archives written by a Soviet journalist named Lev Benjaminsky. Lev was given access to the archives and relayed to the world what the Soviets uncovered in 1945. And it turned out that the Soviets knew far more than they ever let on. The Soviets had discovered Hitler's jawbone only days after Hitler's death. They had learned from those in the bunker roughly where Hitler had been burned and buried, and they found his distinctive jawbone. Once the jawbone had been found, the next step was formal identification. The focus was on finding Hitler's dental records and his dentist, Dr. Hugo Baschke. However, Hugo had left aboard one of the planes escaping Berlin, later arrested and interviewed by the Americans, but the dentist's assistant, Kath Huysman, was tracked down, and she was tasked with identifying Hitler and Braun's remains. Having intimate knowledge of the state of Hitler's teeth and having worked on his dentures, she was able to accurately draw the position of the teeth and the dentures. Upon seeing the actual jawbone, she immediately knew that this jawbone belonged to Hitler, and to corroborate this even further, another dentist who actually built the bridge for Hitler's teeth confirmed that the jawbone did belong to Hitler. It was revealed that by the end of May 1945, the Soviets had conducted in an autopsy report that Hitler was confirmed to be dead. They had located his jawbone, what they believed to be his burnt remains, and had received confirmation from leading Nazis that he was in fact dead. Yet they spread all manner of conspiracy and falsehoods that Hitler was alive and well and living in Argentina. Just why Stalin would push narratives he knew to be untrue is not exactly clear. One explanation could be Stalin's inherent paranoia, and willing to believe the evidence presented to him. Other explanations could be Stalin's attempts to create confusion in the upcoming conflict between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union. What's more, it would divert Allied resources to working out just what happened to Hitler, leading to many fruitless intelligence operations. But whatever the reason, Soviet disinformation would fuel all manner of conspiracies that Hitler had survived the war. Conspiracies as to Hitler's fate would gain traction when in 2009, access to the Soviet archives allowed Western scientists to examine a skull fragment purported to be Hitler's. This skull fragment was discovered in 1946 following another investigation by the Soviets as to Hitler's fate. The skull fragment had been located near where the jawbone had been found and brought evidence of a bullet wound. This would appear to fit the narrative that Hitler had also used a firearm. Like the rest of Hitler's remains, they were archived and kept classified by the Soviets. But in 2009, the skull fragment was subjected to DNA testing, and what they found left investigators surprised. They revealed that the skull fragment belonged to a 40-year-old woman, not the 56-year-old Hitler. The Soviets muddied the waters by insisting the skull was Hitler's, meaning when it was shown to be from someone else, it fed conspiracies that Hitler had survived and had faked his own death. But further confirmation was obtained in 2017 when the jawbone was examined again. Forensic pathologist Philipp Chalia compared the jawbone to X-rays taken of Hitler's mouth in 1944 and carried out a full pathological investigation. Chalia confirmed what was found in 1945 by comparing Hitler's unique placement of only a few remaining teeth and his dentures. In addition, the teeth were examined microscopically, showing no evidence of meat consumption, which would track as Hitler was a vegetarian. In addition, the presence of a bluish deposit on the jaw would indicate a reaction between the dentures and cyanide. In all, the investigation was concluded to a level that would be accepted by criminal courts in determining a deceased person's identity. Nevertheless, conspiracies about Hitler's death and about him escaping continue to this day. There are countless documentaries and videos available speculating that Hitler survived the war. Whilst it's certainly more fun to speculate that he did survive, it should be remembered that such speculation is often rooted not in historical fact, but whatever tells the best story. Often such stories are pushed as the real or hidden truth, portrayed to challenge the official narrative. For some, the notion that Hitler was really alive meant hope that he could be captured and made to face justice. Also, it should be remembered that much of the conspiracy and doubt about Hitler's fate came from the ever-paranoid Stalin, eager to spread disinformation at the start of the Cold War, but today it's just a way to sell an entertaining, if historically inaccurate, story. But, as I mentioned before, Hitler's burned body was recovered by the Soviets. From 1946 to 1970, his body was secretly buried in a Soviet military base in Magdeburg, West Germany. By 1970, this Soviet facility in Magdeburg was being handed over to East German authorities. Fearing that the site might be discovered, a KGB chief ordered that the remains be destroyed once and for all. So, on the 4th of April 1970, a Soviet KGB team exhumed the body of Hitler. It's at this point that his body was completely cremated, turned into ash. The Soviets were concerned about any possible Nazi resurgence and Hitler's burial site becoming a place for worship for neo-Nazis. So, the ashes along with whatever was left of him was scattered into a river returned to the earth from whence he came.